Hello, watch enthusiasts. Now, it's come that time at the beginning of each month where it's time to talk about certain vintage watches that I've found to be exceptional value on the vintage market, especially on the internet, such as eBay, Chrono24, and so on, that I think are very interesting buys to pick up at this point because they're at a low in terms of prices, and also offer interesting features and details that you perhaps wouldn't be able to find in a modern wristwatch. So without any further ado, I'll go on to the first watch on this list. Now, the first brand I'd like to talk about, and their watches, are Alpina. And Alpina are a brand who were bought out a few years ago, and so aren't really the independent brand they used to be. But certainly in their day they were a very prestigious Swiss brand that did compete with the likes of Longines and Omega and Rolex for producing high-quality wristwatches for that era. And in truth, they produced watches which competed with pieces such as the Seamaster and the Oyster Perpetual, as far as being water-resistant dress pieces for those who wanted to have a slightly more active lifestyle. And so as a result, their President line was produced in the 1950s and 60s that became this sort of a sporty model. And really, they've continued this throughout their history, and in terms of the vintage watches available, there are a great deal of options from the brand at really exceptionally low prices. Now, often these watches are shied away from due to the fact they're from a brand that people often haven't really looked into or have only heard of. So as a result, they do tend to pass off for relatively low prices, from £150 through to about £300 in my experience. And one other reason why often people don't look into these watches is that very often they come in smaller sizes, apart from the clearly men's dress models, which would still sit within the boundaries of a man's size today, around the 36 to 40mm size. A great deal of their other watches sit between the 30 and 35mm size, which again is an area where a great deal of people aren't interested in going. So as a result, you end up with a market where there are a great deal of watches around the £150 mark, which offer these fantastic features of very, very nicely decorated dials with applied indices and very nicely finished hands at a very reasonable price. Now, generally with Alpina watches, it's very difficult to find particularly bright watches. They tend to be very sedate dress watches, which I think for some is just what people are after, though obviously if you're looking for something more bright and sporty, they perhaps aren't the best option. Though that said, I've just bought a model from Alpina, a vintage piece, which should be arriving at some point, a little 33mm square piece with a circular dial and a beautiful bluey grey brushed dial, which again does show that in some cases you can get an Alpina with a very elegant aesthetic, while having a certain playful characteristic to it, and certainly that's an example of this situation. Now, in terms of details to look for with these watches or avoid, as with any vintage watch, I would always recommend you look at any photographs of the case back, or look at the case back if you're looking at the watch in person, and avoid watches that say stainless steel case back, or stainless steel back, because this tends to imply that the rest of the case is a plated material, base metal, which tends to reduce the value over time due to the fact that the base metal sheds its coating, leaving rather unsightly marks on it. So that's one detail to look for. Also, water damage to the dials can be a real killer for these watches, and there is a difference between patina in terms of sun damage and water damage, though it's usually fairly obvious if you look at the pictures of the dial. If you see droplet-shaped marks, then generally that's the impact of water. And this doesn't bother everyone, but certainly it's something to look out for if you're not keen on this sort of aesthetic. Now, one other interesting feature about these watches is that if you buy the older vintage models from the 50s, 60s and 70s, you tend to get models which have exclusively in-house movements, which really does add an element of interest to these watches, far beyond what you would see from an ETA-powered piece. Now, the next watch on this list is rather a curious one, and this is a piece that can be acquired for under the £300 mark, other than certain mint examples which I've seen fetching around £400, but usually I would set sub £300 as a reasonable price for these. And this is the Seiko Bellmatic, and it's a Seiko alarm watch from the 1970s. It was produced all the way through the 1970s in both a water-resistant version and a non-water-resistant version. Usually the water-resistant versions are seen after 1972, But I may be wrong. There may have been some produced beforehand, but generally, from my knowledge of having seen these, that was the year the water-resistant ones came into being. And they have slightly different crowns, which are slightly more robust than previous versions. But either way, I wouldn't expect either to be water-resistant after all these years. But then the real reason for these watches being interesting is they offer a very unobtrusive style of alarm display, with the alarm being displayed by an internal bezel around the edge of the dial, with a small triangle depending on the version you get, some with a more complex display and some with a more simple one. But certainly it's a very, very nice way of presenting this alarm function, which is also run by this in-house Seiko movement, which doesn't have the features one would perhaps expect from a modern Seiko movement, especially in the past couple of years, with hacking and hand winding, but in this case one doesn't have that hacking feature. But this won't be a deal breaker for most people, I feel, because you really are getting a great deal for your money, including that alarm and also the day-date function. One very attractive aspect of these watches is the fact that their movements are based on a very simple Seiko architecture, which is very typical of that era and therefore is very easily serviced by most watchmakers, which certainly is a relief, really, when a great deal of vintage watches can be difficult to get serviced, and expensive once you do find someone who is capable of doing so. But the beauty of the Bellmatic, like most Seikos, is there are so many iterations and versions of it that you can really get a model which suits your interests, from a vast number of different dial colours, from very simple silvers to sunburst blues. So there really are versions to choose from. And also there are various case versions. There are the more sought after rounded case versions, which are slightly larger, or the sharper edged, brushed and polished versions, which are my personal favourite, which come in at around 38mm. So this really is all a matter of preference, and also the internal bezels are very different depending on the different versions. And of course the alarm is controlled by that second crown at the 2 o'clock position rather than the central normal crown at 3 o'clock. But really these watches offer a fantastic level of value and versatility, as Seiko always do, at a very, very reasonable price, with that added quirk of having an alarm function. Now the next watch on this list is a Tissot, and probably the most well-known Tissot design there is, to watch lovers and watch collectors. This is the PR516. And the PR516 is not to be confused with the PRS 516, which is the spiritual and design-based successor to this watch, which comes in a much larger size. And in terms of these watches, there's the most standard version, or at least the most well-known version, which is the version with the floating indices that you see on the screen now. And this version has a very stout case, where there's barely any protrusion of the crystal out of the case, and the very blocky sides of the case too, which create a very, very interesting format to the watch, which makes it for a stout style of watch, but without seeming clunky, which is very, very rare, really, for a timepiece, especially a dress watch of this type, which has its sporting credentials, but nonetheless is still a dress watch at base. And these more traditional versions of the 516 are known for their beautiful sunburst silver or blue dials, depending on the version you get, and their day-date indication at 3 o'clock, courtesy of the ETA-based movement inside them. Now they have a general brushing over the top of the watch, which adds to that flat aesthetic to the top of the watch, which is again something a lot of people appreciate, and has polished sides. Now the watches in this price point tend to have the integrated bracelet, which, as you can see, is not really an optional piece in terms of whether you wear it on the bracelet or not. It really is integrated in the most formal of senses. So that is something to understand when buying one of these watches, because the versions with the normal lugs tend to be much, much more expensive and much more rare. But anyway, these watches are certainly very interesting in terms of showing a playful and interesting piece from Tissot's history, with, as I've said, those beautiful floating polished indices which sit above the dial, and the hands actually pass underneath, which is a very rare thing on a watch, and very, very interesting to see, especially at the prices you can get these for, which tend to sit around the £200 to £500 category, depending on the version. Now the PR516 also has a lot of little offshoots, which are quite interesting as well. There are versions with alarms, there are diving versions, compressor-style versions with alarms as well. So there really are a great number of different variations on the theme of the 516. And my personal choice to also mention today is that diving alarm version called the Sonorous, rather jokingly, And it has the same interesting aesthetics on the dial, though it doesn't have those floating indices anymore, but rather has opted for a more simple style of fixed indices, which I think also match those hands very nicely. And these watches have a rotating bezel, and of course that alarm function, which is shown through the case back, which has a setup to allow the vibrations of the alarm to be heard, which certainly is an interesting piece, and this alarm, due to the design of it having those ports in the back, allows the alarm to be heard underwater. Though, of course, I wouldn't suggest these watches to be taken underwater without a full service, due to the fact that vintage watches tend to not be watertight anymore. These watches actually feature proper lugs as well, which allows you to put a proper bracelet or strap on it if you so wish, adding to a degree of the practicality of the watch. Though it must be said these are relatively small watches, so that is something to consider before looking into these. But the price for these is very reasonable, I feel, considering the fact that you are getting an entirely Swiss-made mechanical alarm watch, and these are manually wound rather than being automatic. But nonetheless, this is a very small price to pay, since you are getting a Swiss, rather impressive and interesting steel alarm watch with those diving credentials from a brand as reputable as Tissot. So I must say these are very, very good value, considering that a version of these in good nick will usually set you back about £300, but for a really mint version, £500 is a reasonable bet. So really, these are quite excellent watches for the money in terms of Swiss-made horology. Now, I think the reason why these watches are such good value, along with the PR516 Seastar, as you see on the screen now, is that whereas the bright blue floating indice versions have been remade in 2012 at Baselworld as a re-edition of the PR516, and also, again, the PRS 516 being released, has boosted the vintage price of these. Whereas these versions, which are relatively unknown, really don't command that sort of price point. Now, the next brand that's doing particularly well this month is Zenith. And Zenith produce a great deal of interesting watches, and did indeed produce a great deal of interesting watches throughout the last century. And they're a brand which I think often doesn't get quite as much good publicity as they should, because after all they did co-invent the first automatic chronograph. So in that respect they really are a very historic brand. And the prices for their watches really do range from about £350 to £1,000 depending on the model. And of course this doesn't include models like the El Primero, for instance, that are greatly iconic and very, very sought after. Now, what I think is wonderful about these vintage Zenith models is that they offer incredible quality, because of course Zenith were a very, very high-end brand, competing with the likes of Rolex and Omega. So as a result, the watches that you're able to get for this price really do offer a fantastic level of care and detail. So one has beautiful, simple dialed models, which act as really wonderful dress watches, and actually Zenith do often make larger size watches, and did indeed in their older years. And of course their oversized models in the 1950s, for instance, are now the perfect size really for someone to wear a watch that seems relatively modernly sized, in this day and age at least. So one has these great oversized dress watches, which for the era, a 40mm dress watch was oversized. So as a result, you have watches which are really wonderful in terms of sizing, for those who prefer a larger watch. Similarly, Zenith are very, very keen as a brand today, and indeed in their history, in producing watches with slightly more interesting and different case shapes and designs. So you have very interesting brushed cases with a very flat profile, very similar in fact to the Tissot PR5516 that I showed you earlier on in the video. So that's an interesting aspect to the brand, because they do offer a fantastic variation in their watches, especially for this sort of price point. And of course for the more detailed offerings one will have to reach towards the £1,000 mark, but I must say they really are worth it. Now for this price point one really is looking at stainless steel cases. Some of the earlier models do sometimes have plated cases, so it is always worth checking the case back to see if it says stainless steel or stainless steel back, to get a good idea of it, and also to look for marks on the case that might suggest that it is in fact a plated case. But more often than not, and far more often than not at least, in the case of Zenith, one is looking at a stainless steel case, which certainly is a good thing to see, because of course you don't have to worry about that coating coming off. And of course, whilst one shouldn't polish a case too often, if one wants to, one can with a stainless steel case without the concern of that finishing coming off. If one takes to a coated finish, just as a gold-plated watch can be quite an inconvenience. Now, the finishing of the movements, which is really excellent in the case of these watches, since they were premium products, as I feel Zenith rightly should be. The movements were beautifully made. But this is also mirrored by the quality of the dials and hands, where one has these wonderful dials with a number of different finishes on them, everything from guilloche through to hobnail effects, and all the way through to concentric brushing on subdials and so on, which really does give an air of quality to these watches, which they certainly have. Also, one has wonderful finishes on the hands, from very highly polished and beveled hands, which are very, very well made, all the way through to hands which are blued in them with the utmost care taken to produce a pleasant finish. Now, the final watch I'd like to talk about is the Rolex Oyster Precision. And the Oyster Precision is really a quirk in the Rolex past lineup, because it offers features that one would not normally see for this price point. So you are getting the original Rolex Oyster case for between £900 and £1,800. And these watches are watches which I think often overlooked because they don't feature the Oyster Perpetual movement, but rather have a manually wound version, which effectively is an Oyster Perpetual automatic Rolex in-house movement, except that it's lost its automatic winding mechanism on the back, thus resulting in a much slimmer movement, which is transferred into the thickness of the case. So effectively what one is getting with these watches for the very reduced price really of a maximum of really £1,800 for these watches is a more dress-orientated and much more simple and, in my opinion, elegant version of the Oyster Perpetual, in that you're getting a watch which has far less text on the dial, for instance. So you simply have Rolex Oyster and Precision, or Oyster Date if you have the date version. But I do think that it adds a certain refinement and finesse to this watch that wasn't there in the original, in that you are getting a watch which is much closer to a traditional dress watch because of that thin case, but also that retains the water resistance that you would expect to see from a Rolex Oyster watch. So you really are getting the best of both worlds, and bringing the traditional Oyster even closer to a dress watch in its most traditional sense. But of course you are still getting the traditional Rolex Oyster bracelet with this watch, thus adding a certain degree of value to it. Now these watches were produced from the mid-50s through to the 70s, so they really did change over the years, with, for example, the hands becoming far pointier in its final years of production. But certainly these watches were very interesting in terms of what they offered, and of course people grew tired of having 34mm watches, which of course these watches are, which is something to certainly consider before buying one of these. They are smaller sizes. That said though, they do have relatively beefy proportions due to the fact that they have that Oyster case with those flowing edges, rather than a traditional circular watch with jutting out lugs. So that does have an effect on making the watch sit better on the wrist, and similarly the bracelet fits very well on the wrist as well, though of course one does have to look out for stretching with these bracelets because they don't feature solid links due to their age. One real advantage to these watches is that with regards to the sale of these watches, there are a great deal of different versions on the market with different types of bezels, from smooth bezel to knurled bezels to more traditional fluted bezels. And also similarly, dial options are very, very varied, from blues to brushed patterns, through to fabric and linen style dials, or simple frosted style dials. So really there are a great deal of options to choose from, which do add a certain degree of interest to these watches. Anyway, I'll conclude the video here, but thank you very much for watching, and please do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of my various choices for this month, and what you think of the various watches available, and if there are any things that you might have included in the video instead. So thank you very much for watching, and please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to enjoy more content here on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. This is Simon the Watch Guy, over and out.